My cousin belittled my achievements, smeared my military honor, and Dad took his side, so I hauled them into court and let karma finish the rest. Hello, my name is Vienna, and I used to believe that wearing the uniform meant I'd finally earned their respect. But the night my cousin broke into my army quarters and beat me bloody while my father stood there watching, I realized I'd been wrong my whole life. They didn't just ignore me. They rewrote my story, erased my medals, called me unstable behind my back. They burned my mother's letters. They gave my commendation to him. And when I finally stood up for myself, they called it betrayal. Was it ever really about honor? Or did they just need someone like me to stay quiet so the lie could keep marching forward? Do you want to know what silence costs and what truth sounds like when you finally say it out loud? The hall smelled of polished wood and brass polish. The kind of scent you only notice when you're standing in dress uniform waiting for a microphone. I'd spent weeks rehearsing the words I wanted to say. Simple, steady, a thank you to my team. When they called my name, the applause echoed. I stepped up, chest tight with pride and nerves. But before I could open my mouth, I saw my father stand. Harlan Creed's voice carried through the room the way it always had in my childhood. Commanding. Heavy. Certain. We should remember the sacrifices of men like Cyrus Thorne, he declared, gesturing toward my cousin sitting smugly near the front row. His discipline shaped those around him. The crowd clapped again, louder this time, and my chance evaporated. My notes trembled in my hand. My father never even looked at me. He shifted the attention as though I had been a placeholder until the real soldier could be praised. I smiled thinly, nodded, and stepped back. Outwardly calm. Inside, I felt the same hollow sting I had known since childhood. The sting of being erased. When the ceremony ended, I moved quickly toward the exit. People shook Cyrus's hand, patted my father's shoulder, and hardly noticed me slipping away. I walked across the base, heels of my shoes sharp against the concrete. The cool North Carolina evening pressed in. My barracks room felt smaller than usual when I unlocked the door. I closed it behind me quietly, set my cap on the desk, and hung up the uniform jacket as carefully as if it were made of glass. Every ribbon pinned to that fabric carried a weight. But tonight they felt like ornaments on a borrowed coat. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought back to years earlier. School competitions where I'd brought home a medal only to be told it was cute. Then watching Cyrus win a lesser trophy and be treated like a conquering hero. Some patterns never changed. I pulled out my journal, the one habit I'd kept from deployments overseas. Writing steadied me. I put down a few lines about the ceremony, about my father's words, about the way the room had swallowed my voice whole. The sun slipped away. The bass grew quiet, the distant sound of boots on pavement fading until all I heard was the hum of the small lamp on my desk. I laid down, letting the pen rest on the open page. That's when it came. A crash so violent it rattled the window. My door flew open, slamming into the wall. Cyrus stood in the frame, shoulders hunched, eyes bloodshot. His breath carried the sour of whiskey. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stormed in, shouting, spitting words between clenched teeth. You think you can stand there and take what I built? You think you deserve to wear that uniform more than me? I rose instinctively, heart pounding. You need to leave, Cyrus, now. He laughed, a harsh bark. You embarrassed the family. You've always been a fraud. The blow came fast. His fist against my shoulder, forcing me back into the desk. Pain shot down my arm and the journal scattered to the floor. I tried to push him away, but his size swallowed mine. Another strike landed against my ribs. The air rushed out of me. I gasped, vision swimming, and then through the blur, I saw movement in the doorway. My father, Harlan Creed, stood there, arms folded loosely across his chest, eyes locked on us. He didn't shout. He didn't step forward. He didn't even blink. Dad. The word caught in my throat. Cyrus drove his knee into my side. My legs buckled. I fell to the floor, tasting iron in my mouth. My body screamed, but my mind screamed louder. He's watching. He sees this. Say you're nothing, Cyrus roared, grabbing my hair, pulling my face up. I searched my father's expression, begging for some sign of intervention, but his face stayed cold, unreadable. The silence from him burned deeper than the bruises already forming on my skin. Another blow split across my cheekbone. My body gave way. The journal pages crumpled beneath me. I dragged myself an inch, another inch toward the small green radio by my bed, the emergency unit every soldier kept. My ribs protested with each breath, but I pressed the code switch 3 times. The device beeped faintly, a signal racing out across the base. Cyrus, consumed by rage, didn't notice. He shouted over me, his words like venom. "Nobody will believe you. Not them, not the army, not even your own father." And still my father remained at the doorway, motionless. Then in the distance, I heard it. The rising wail of military police sirens. Cyrus froze for a moment, eyes darting. "This isn't over." He shoved me down, spun, and bolted out of the room. I turned my head just in time to see my father step aside, letting him pass. Not a word, not a hand raised, just a quiet, steady departure. The silence pressed on me like a second assault. I lay there, chest heaving, until the MPs burst in, their voices overlapping. "Soldier down. Get her stable. We need medics." Hands lifted me, strapped me onto a stretcher, the fluorescent lights of the hallway blurred into streaks. I felt cold steel beneath me, the weight of bandages being wrapped. But the only thought I could hold on to was simple, sharp, unrelenting. He saw it. He saw everything. And he turned away. I closed my eyes, not from exhaustion, but from disbelief. Blood, bruises, broken bones. None of it hurt as much as the truth of that moment. If that wasn't enough for him to step in, what would ever be? I wasn't ready to fight back then. But I am now. I opened my eyes to the soft rhythm of beeping monitors and the sterile scent of antiseptic. The ceiling was pale, colorless, like the voice I'd used during deployment debriefs, flat, professional, void of anything human. My arm throbbed beneath the weight of a thick sling. And when I tried to shift, a sharp ache shot through my ribs, reminding me that the night hadn't been a dream. But it wasn't the pain that settled hardest. It was the echo of silence. My father's silence. He stood there. He saw Cyrus break me. And he chose nothing. I blinked slowly, adjusting to the fluorescent light above. A nurse came in, glanced at my vitals, then offered the kind of practiced smile reserved for those who knew too much to ask questions. "You're stable?" she said softly. The MPs filed an initial report. "You'll be briefed later today." I nodded once, barely. She placed a white envelope on the tray beside me before stepping out. No return address, no emblem, just my name, scrawled in ink that looked like it belonged to a legal office rather than a hospital. I didn't open it right away. My hand hovered, uncertain if I was strong enough to read what I already suspected. I reached for it anyway. The letter was clinical. Cold. Notice of temporary suspension pending psychological evaluation. The justification, recent indications of emotional instability and questionable field conduct. My heart pounded louder than any battlefield explosion I'd ever heard. At the bottom, under supporting statements, was my father's name. I dropped the paper. He hadn't just stood by. He'd added his name to the lie. I sat frozen for a long time, letting the silence fill in the blanks. I didn't cry. That kind of reaction would have made the report feel more accurate. Instead, I stared at the wall across from me, trying to recall the last time I believed my father had my back. And then my phone lit up. A message from my cousin Marcy quickly retracted. But not before I saw the preview. A screenshot from a family group chat I hadn't been part of in years. My stomach twisted as I opened it. The thread wasn't long, but every word sliced deeper than the last. She always had a flair for drama. Maybe she hit herself. Wouldn't be the first time she exaggerated. She's unstable like her mother was. And then I saw it. A thumbs up emoji from my father. Not even a sentence. Just a symbol that said everything. I stared at the screen until it blurred. It wasn't the insult that stung. It was the confirmation. What I feared was true. He never believed me. He never even tried. My hand shook as I held the phone, thumb hovering over the call icon next to his name. I pressed it. One ring. I hung up. Whatever part of me had still hoped for an explanation, a confrontation, even a cowardly excuse, it died in that second. I lay back, trying to breathe evenly despite the pressure in my chest. Not from the broken ribs, but from the truth finally settling in. A knock interrupted the spiral. A nurse stepped in. "You have 5 minutes if you're feeling up to it. Legal wants to confirm your version of events." My version. I wanted to laugh. There was the truth. And then there were the narratives people build to protect themselves. And my father, he was a master builder. I didn't speak much during the interview, just the basics. Facts, times, locations, no opinions, no emotion. After they left, I scrolled through old photos on my phone. Not of war zones or medals, but of a much younger me. ROTC competition, first in the region. I still remembered the smell of cut grass and sunblock. I'd stood there with my ribbon, scanning the crowd for my father's face. He never came. Said he had work. Said it wasn't a big deal. It always wasn't a big deal when it was me. Later that evening, a nurse brought me some fresh water and checked my vitals again. Her badge read Carla. She was older than most of the staff. Kind eyes, firm hands. "You're quiet," she said. "You sure you don't want to talk to someone?" I looked at her. "I don't need a therapist. I need a record that doesn't get edited." She paused, lips pressed. "That's fair." She stood to leave but then turned back. "If you change your mind, the chaplain comes by Tuesdays." I didn't answer. That night, as the bass quieted outside the medical wing and the hallway lights dimmed, I turned toward the window and stared at the shadows moving across the pavement. I knew what was coming. The family spin, the reputation management, the half-truths dressed up as honor. Cyrus wouldn't be punished. My father would be praised for trying to contain the fallout. And me, I'd be the soldier who cracked, the woman too fragile to handle pressure, the one with emotional instability. Unless I fought back, not with fists. That wasn't my way. I needed documentation. I needed proof. I needed allies who wouldn't flinch when it got ugly. A nurse stopped in briefly to check my IV. She looked tired, but kind. I asked her quietly, "Do you know who took my uniform after the MPs brought me in?" She nodded. "Security has it logged." "Why?" I didn't answer, but I knew what I was looking for. The emergency beacon on my belt, the one I hit before I passed out. If it still worked, it would have a timestamp. It would show I was under attack, that I tried to call for help, that I wasn't unstable, I was targeted. In the quiet, I tapped open my notes app and typed a single sentence. "They're writing their version. But I'll write mine." The words still echoed in my head as I watched the sky outside the hospital window shift from soft gray to the deep blue of early dawn. I wasn't ready to fight back then, but I am now. Saying it to myself gave me just enough oxygen to stay afloat, but meaning it, that was going to take more. The IV beeped softly beside me. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the room would transform. Walls melting into memories I'd buried so deep even I'd forgotten where they started. But not anymore. That morning, as the halls outside began to buzz with nurses changing shifts and carts rolling over linoleum, I leaned back into my pillow and let it happen. I let the memories rise like floodwater. The first time I knew something wasn't right, I was 10. I'd spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon trying to glue the wings of a model airplane without letting the propeller droop. My fingers were sticky. My bangs kept falling into my face. But I didn't care. I wanted my dad to see it. I wanted him to be proud. Harlan Creed sat at the table thumbing through a military magazine, half listening. When I walked over and held out the plane with a hopeful smile, he barely glanced up. "You bent the rudder," he muttered. "I can fix it." He shook his head, sighing like I'd handed him a broken promise instead of a plastic model. "You're clumsy, just like your mother." Then he called Cyrus over. My cousin, 2 years older, always visiting, always treated like more than just family. Dad handed the plane to him like passing a torch. "Show her how it's done." Cyrus smirked, puffed up a little, and took it from me without a word. From that day forward, I started keeping my victories to myself. When I made the drill team in 8th grade, I didn't tell anyone. When I placed first in our regional ROTC meet, I left the trophy on my bedroom shelf. It collected dust next to the framed picture of my father pinning a ribbon on Cyrus's chest at a high school banquet. I wasn't in the photo. I wasn't even invited. Cyrus always wore the uniform like it was designed for him. Me, I wore it like armor. I remember one family barbecue right after we both started basic. Cyrus showed up in full ROTC gear, polished to the point of blinding. My dad couldn't stop talking about him. His leadership, his posture, the way he carried Creed blood with honor. I was in uniform, too. Not that anyone noticed. Not bad for a girl, someone muttered behind me as I reached for a soda. I didn't turn to see who said it. It could have been any of them. It didn't matter. What I do remember is the way my father clapped Cyrus on the back and said, "This one, he's going to make the family proud." Funny how some words stick harder than bruises. I had tried to earn that pride for years. I ran faster, studied harder, volunteered for every difficult rotation. I stitched up wounds in sandstorms, dug foxholes through heat stroke, and memorized medical procedures while bullets tore through the air overhead. But none of it erased what my father already decided. I was a placeholder until a real Creed came along. It wasn't until our first overseas deployment that things started to shift. Cyrus had been assigned to lead a field exercise. Nothing major, just basic patrol formation and evac simulation. But he panicked. A loud crack from nearby sent him diving for cover, leaving half the unit exposed and 2 new recruits without direction. One of them fell, dislocating his shoulder and breaking 2 ribs on the way down. The other froze, unable to move. I was nearby, not even part of that unit, just off shift, but I saw it. I rushed over, redirected the rest of the team, secured the perimeter, and started triage right there in the dust. No time to wait. I relocated the dislocation, stabilized the ribs, and ordered the medevac myself. We filed our reports. Mine was clinical, exact. I noted every misstep, not out of spite, but because that's what the record demanded. The next day, I got called into the base commander's tent. "You don't need to name names," he said, looking directly at me. "You can reword the report." I remember blinking. "Sir?" He leaned back, laced his fingers together. "We don't want to destroy anyone's career over one bad call. Family reputation, you know. Let's protect each other." I knew what he was saying. Cyrus's name never made it into the final document, but my actions did. Sort of. When the quarterly commendation list came out, there was my name. One line. Exemplary response under pressure. No story, no detail, no truth. Meanwhile, Cyrus got reassigned to a quieter post, then came back later with a story about testing field strategies under duress. No one questioned it. Why would they? That was the moment I stopped believing in the idea of fairness in uniform. Now, lying in the hospital bed, that old frustration crawled back under my skin like a thorn. I grabbed my tablet and opened my personnel file. I scrolled until I found the field report from that deployment, the one I had written myself. It was different, sanitized, shortened. The names were gone. The incident condensed into 3 sentences, ending with a vague "team response successful." My name was mentioned once as one of multiple responders. They'd edited me out of my own history. I set the tablet down and let my hand rest on my stomach, breathing through the ache in my ribs. They'd been rewriting my story since I was 10. Well, not anymore. I gave them a choice. I hoped they'd choose wisely. Turns out hope is just the polite word we use when we're too tired to say we expect the worst. It was just after 7 a.m. when I stepped out of the medical wing. My arm still ached in its sling, and I walked slow, every movement pulling against bruised ribs and older wounds that didn't show on x-rays. The base felt different. Not quieter, but sharper. People didn't avoid me. Not exactly. But I noticed who didn't meet my eye. Who took the long route around the hallway, who whispered just a little too loudly when they thought I was out of earshot. They weren't looking at me like a victim. They were looking at me like I disrupted the order of things. That's how I knew the story was working. Their version of it. Around mid-morning, I stopped in the base's common area. Not because I had business there, but because it gave me line of sight on faces. Not names, not titles, just reactions. I sat in a corner booth with a lukewarm cup of coffee, letting my fingers tap quietly against the ceramic. The tension sat in my shoulders like sandbags. Then Diego walked in. He was barely 20, skinny, too polite for his own good. We'd crossed paths a few times on base, mostly during training runs. He was the type who always said, "Ma'am," even when you asked him not to. He looked around like he was expecting someone, then spotted me. He didn't wave, just walked over, hands deep in his pockets, jaw tight. "You didn't get this from me," he said quietly, and slipped a flash drive onto the table. I didn't move to touch it right away. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "Just listen to it when you're alone." Before I could respond, he turned and walked out like he'd forgotten something. That night after dinner, I returned to my room. The light stayed low. I sat on the edge of the bed, plugged the drive into my tablet, and pressed play. At first, it was static, gritty, uneven. Then came voices, male, aggressive. "You don't get to wear that uniform like it means something." That was Cyrus. I'd know that voice anywhere. A pause. More shuffling. Then another voice. "My father. Just finish this. She needs to be put in her place." That sentence, simple, calm, spoken like someone ordering coffee, hit me harder than any punch. I froze. Every part of me wanted to stop the recording, throw the tablet across the room, scream. But I didn't. I listened all the way through. The file was only a few minutes long, mostly noise and fragments. But those words, they were enough. My father's voice confirming what I already knew, but still hadn't dared to accept. This wasn't just about Cyrus. It was never just him. I closed the file and backed it up in 3 different places just in case. The next day, Dorian Lex asked to meet. He'd sent a message through secure base chat. Not the kind of guy to be careless. We met at a small cafe just outside the south gate, one of those quiet places where locals pretended not to notice soldiers. He was already there when I arrived, sipping on something too strong to be regular coffee. He didn't rise when I sat down, just looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "I'm assuming this isn't a social visit," I said. "No," he replied. "And you're not safe here." I folded my hands, letting them rest on the table. "Because I got beat up in my own barracks, and the report says I imagined it." Dorian's jaw tightened. "There's pressure from above. They want this wrapped up. Personal dispute, no charges, no noise." The officers with stars, ones who still believe family reputation matters more than truth. He hesitated. "They told me to keep my mouth shut. And I'm not going to." We sat in silence for a moment. Outside the window, a pair of teenagers argued over a soda machine. It reminded me of how far away normal life had drifted. "Vienna," he said finally. "They're not afraid of your story. They're afraid someone will believe it." I nodded once. "Then let's make sure someone does." That night, I went back to my quarters and sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes I hadn't opened in years. I dug through every deployment journal, field report, email archive, and backup hard drive I had. Every misstep that got buried, every commendation that got redirected, every silence I let slide, I cataloged them one by one. They wanted me to disappear. But if I did, I'd leave behind a map. I pulled out the tablet and opened a new email draft. No recipient, just a message. "If you're reading this, it means they succeeded in stopping me. So, start here." Attached were 3 files. 1 copy of the audio, 1 backup of my suppressed report, and 1 spreadsheet listing every date I had documented abuse, neglect, or manipulation from either Cyrus or Harlan Creed. I encrypted the email, saved it to 3 cloud accounts, and wrote the password down in a journal only 2 people in the world knew existed. My mother and me. My hand hovered over the keyboard. I wanted to write more. Explain everything. Apologize for not doing this sooner. But I didn't. I wrote one line. If I disappear, start with this. Then I hit save. I made my move. They didn't hesitate to make theirs. It started subtle, as these things always do. Looks exchanged across briefing tables. A laugh cut too short when I entered a room. Files I requested mysteriously delayed. A weight built slowly behind every door I opened, like the air had thickened just enough to remind me I was no longer welcome in the spaces I'd once earned. But I expected it. What I didn't expect came later that week when I walked past the Hall of Commendations on the eastern wing of the base headquarters. I wasn't heading there for any particular reason, just taking a longer path to the PX to clear my head. My breath caught mid-step when I saw it. A new photo had been framed. The golden trim caught the light perfectly, highlighting Cyrus's smug face, frozen in a pose that mimicked humility. He stood before a general, being handed a medal I recognized in an instant, because it had been mine. The commendation was for extraordinary triage under hostile conditions. Syria 2019. The report was vague, but I didn't need to read the full plaque to know what it referenced. The day we lost contact with the second unit, the explosion, the collapsed field post, the bleeding soldier I pulled out with my own hands while enemy fire echoed in the distance. That mission had nearly cost me the use of my left wrist. My knuckles had bled raw through the gloves. I hadn't slept for 36 hours afterward. And now the man who had panicked and disappeared halfway through the evacuation was standing on that wall like he'd bled for the cause. It was like watching a stranger live your life better than you. I turned sharply and made my way to the base archivist's office. The assistant on duty, a young corporal with tired eyes and too many pens in his shirt pocket, looked up as I entered. "Can I help you, Lieutenant? I need to see the commendation paperwork filed for Staff Sergeant Cyrus Thorne," I said, calm but firm. He hesitated. "That might require clearance. I was the medic on that mission." "I'll wait while you check." He nodded and disappeared into the back. It took him 10 minutes to return, holding a thin file. "Here you go, ma'am," he said, already regretting it. I flipped through the papers. My name wasn't in the report. Not once. "What about the triage notes?" I asked. "There were none submitted," he replied, fidgeting with his pen. "Who filed this version?" He glanced at the final page. "Says H. Creed signed off on verification." My breath left my body in one long, low exhale. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the folder. I simply nodded, closed the file, and handed it back. "Thank you," I said, and walked out. By that afternoon, I'd received an invite to a private memorial gathering for fallen medics. It wasn't public, wasn't mandatory, just something informal the base chaplain put together annually. I debated going, but I needed to see Cyrus. I arrived just before dusk. The gathering was held in a small garden behind the chapel, sunlight casting long shadows over marble benches and flower beds trimmed too neatly to be natural. A dozen people stood in clusters, holding plastic cups of punch, whispering in voices that carried too easily over the quiet. And there he was, Cyrus, standing near the far bench, hands behind his back, shoulders straight, the same pose he used in every photograph, like he'd memorized it from a manual. I walked up behind him slowly, deliberately. He turned when he heard my steps. "You know," I said quietly, "the problem with stealing something that doesn't belong to you is you never quite know how to carry it." His lips curled, but not into a smile. "Still making everything about yourself, huh? You mean like when I dragged 2 men through blood-soaked gravel while you were hiding behind a Humvee?" He rolled his eyes. "You've always been dramatic, and you've always been afraid someone would notice you were average." He stepped closer. "Look around, Vienna. Nobody cares about who did what anymore. They care about the version that makes sense, and I make sense." I tilted my head slightly. "You think history is just who tells the story loudest?" "No, it's who tells it first." I leaned in close enough that he flinched. "You can lie to them all you want, but you know who saved those men, and so do I." He shrugged. "No one remembers what they don't see." I didn't blink. "You just did." I left him standing there, the shadow swallowing him as the sun finally dipped. Back in my quarters that evening, I opened the audio message app on my phone. I recorded my voice, steady, even, free of anything that could be called emotional. To Harlan Creed and Cyrus Thorne, I began. I won't be quiet anymore. I won't wait for apologies. I won't rewrite my history to make you feel comfortable. If you come for me again, come with a lawyer. I attached the voice file to a secure thread I'd created earlier. One that also contained copies of the altered commendation reports and photos of the original triage wounds taken the day after Syria. They wanted a fight. They were going to get one. The message showed as read within minutes. No reply came, but that was enough. I closed the laptop and let myself feel something new. Not grief, not rage, but clarity. Let them feel what it's like to be watched. I made my move. They didn't hesitate to make theirs. The news clip aired at 6:43 p.m. right in between local sports and the weather forecast. Subtle placement if you wanted just the right people to catch it without looking like you were pushing an agenda. A calculated whisper, not a shout. I had just returned to my room from the conference, still in uniform, my badge for the regional military medical event tucked into my chest pocket. My heels were off and the skin behind my ears ached from the pressure of my hair pulled back too tightly all day. I didn't even know the interview was coming. The anchor's voice caught my attention mid-sentence. Accusations made anonymously threatening the careers of decorated military personnel. And then came his face. Cyrus Thorne, polished, calm, sitting in the familiar frame of the local studio set, the blue curtain behind him rippling slightly in the AC breeze. He wore a crisp collared shirt, not the uniform. Civilian clothes. Casual, trustworthy. I won't speculate, he said, voice smooth like someone reading from a teleprompter. But it's dangerous when people allow personal vendettas to bleed into official records, especially when those records can ruin the reputation of real soldiers doing real work. The host, a man I'd seen anchor July 4th parades with way too much flag lapel pin enthusiasm, nodded sympathetically. There are always two sides, Sergeant Thorne. There are, Cyrus agreed, leaning forward slightly. But the louder side isn't always the honest one. I stared at the screen. He didn't use my name, of course. That would have been too direct. But he didn't have to. Unstable, angry, unfit. That's what he called me. Just not with those exact words. Just enough suggestion to ignite every rumor waiting to spark. I sat back slowly, the ache in my shoulders flaring again. I should have known he'd go there. I should have known he wouldn't come back at me with fists this time. Now it was image against image, narrative against narrative. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I turned the television off and let the silence fill the room again. Then I got to work. I didn't fight back publicly. That wasn't the play. Not yet. Instead, I opened a private encrypted thread I'd started the week prior. A quiet conversation with a network of women I'd met during deployments in hospitals and after-action reports, medics, intelligence officers, military spouses, some retired, some still active. Each one of them had a story. None of them had felt safe enough to tell it. Not where it counted until now. I spent the next 4 hours typing. I didn't write mine first. I started with theirs. I removed names, sanitized dates, altered ranks just enough to protect identities, but not enough to make them unrecognizable to the right eyes. Assault, intimidation, gaslighting, paperwork errors, transferred complaints, promotion blocks, injuries rewritten as accidents. It was a language of silence, and we all spoke it fluently. Then when the file was long enough, when it looked more like a pattern than a collection of isolated events, I added my piece. Just a few paragraphs, clean, controlled, no adjectives, no bitterness, just data, time, place, action. I labeled it Field Notes, Internal, and then I sent it to a reporter I trusted from a national military watchdog group. We'd crossed paths once during a press briefing overseas. She was sharp, soft-spoken, the kind who listened more than she talked. The message was short. No names, just read, then decide. She responded an hour later. This is bigger than you think. I shut my laptop and leaned back, my body finally catching up to the weight of the last 3 weeks. In the morning, the anonymous story ran on their site, buried deep enough to avoid notice, but placed smartly for those who knew where to look. It didn't explode. It didn't go viral. But it started a tremor. At the chow hall, someone nodded at me. In the hallway, a junior officer stopped talking when I walked by. Not out of avoidance, but like he was thinking too hard to keep his sentence going. I felt it in the air. Something new. They didn't all believe me, but they didn't all believe him anymore, either. By sunset, I sat on the bench outside the barracks, the breeze carrying the faint sound of training drills from a distant field. I took off my boots, stretched my legs, and opened my email again. A new message waited from the reporter. Subject line: "If you want to go on record, I'm ready." No pressure, no push, just the door held open, waiting. I looked across the grass to where the memorial stone sat, names carved deep. I thought of the men I'd carried, the ones who couldn't speak anymore. I thought of my mother's voice, soft in memory, saying, "Don't fight to be heard. Fight to be remembered." Right? Then I looked down at my uniform. Not the one I'd worn when they pinned the ribbon on me, or the one they stole the credit from, but the one I'd rebuilt. Stitched buttons, repressed patches, name tag replaced after it was misplaced during the hospital transfer. It wasn't about vengeance anymore. This was something else. The silence that once broke me will now be my weapon. By the time I stepped out of the courthouse, the heat of the midday sun hit me like it had been waiting to confront me, too. The press had gathered near the steps, not in waves, but just enough to make my breath hitch. A few microphones extended toward me, blinking red with record lights. I didn't say a word, just looked straight ahead and kept walking. What could I have said that hadn't already been twisted before? The moment I passed through the glass doors, I knew I was past the point of return. Filing charges meant every word, every bruise, every gap in my father's silence was now on record. No longer private, no longer controllable. It was war, but not with bullets or uniforms. This was courtrooms and press clippings, and they weren't prepared for me in this arena. The night before, I had received my discharge medical file from the base clinic after weeks of back and forth requests. I opened the envelope slowly, scanning for the phrasing I feared most. Rib fractures, recurrent trauma, noted, consistent with previous history. Previous history. I stared at those words for what felt like hours. That single line changed the tone of my case from attack to ongoing behavior. I flipped to the scan date. It was wrong. A full 8 days before the actual incident, someone had moved the clock. They wanted the injury to look like an old one that could be explained away by training mishaps or long deployment wear. I didn't cry, but my jaw locked so tight I thought I might break my own teeth. I called a friend who worked at a civilian clinic off base. He owed me a favor. Within 12 hours, I was in their exam room, back exposed to cold equipment. The technician didn't know the full story, and I didn't offer one. The next morning, he handed me a digital scan with the date embedded, timestamped less than 48 hours prior. Fresh rib fractures, clear signs of blunt force impact. No possibility it could have been misread. I had the proof, but it didn't prepare me for what came next. When I returned to my quarters, the hallway was unusually quiet. I didn't notice anything wrong until I saw my door slightly ajar. I froze. A beat passed. Then I pushed it open. At first, it looked normal, everything still in place until I walked to the corner where my small wooden keepsake box sat, or used to. It was gone. I turned slowly, scanning every shelf, drawer, under the bed. Nothing. It wasn't until I stepped outside again that I smelled it. Burnt wood. I followed the scent around the side of the building near the maintenance trash bins. There, inside a dented metal can, sat the blackened remains of the box. Letters, my mother's handwriting, half curled into ash. One edge of a photograph had melted into the metal it had been stored with. My knees gave slightly, but I didn't fall. Instead, I reached in carefully and lifted a piece. The char smeared onto my palm, staining me with the remains of what had once been proof I'd existed, proof that my mother loved me, that I had done something worth remembering. They weren't just trying to discredit me, they were trying to erase me. I stood there for several minutes breathing smoke and memory. Then I walked inside, washed my hands, and called Dorian. He didn't ask questions, just said, "I'll be there in 10. We drove in silence to the county courthouse, an unassuming brick building with faded signage and more squirrels on the lawn than people. He parked in back. I opened the door before the engine stopped. Inside, the clerk at the front desk asked for my ID. I handed it over with one hand, the other holding the folder that now contained my medical records, the audio clip, the letter from my father co-signing the falsified incident report, and the time-stamped burn photo I had printed from my phone. It took 15 minutes to file the paperwork. Assault, obstruction, conspiracy. I asked for the paperwork to be stamped in duplicate. As I exited the building, the press had arrived. I didn't stop. I didn't smile and I didn't run, but I did pause as I passed one camera. I looked directly into the lens, holding its gaze for a second too long. They'll spin this, I thought. They'll try to say I was bitter, emotional, out for revenge. Let them. I wasn't there to win a popularity contest. I was there to be heard. And if it took court records, news footage, and burnt paper to make that happen, so be it. I reached my car, exhaled fully, and leaned my forehead against the steering wheel. It didn't feel like relief. It felt like steady ground. For the first time in weeks, I had both feet on it. The silence they had used against me was mine now. Because healing is harder than any war I've ever fought. The room had mostly emptied. The hum of reporters packing up their gear mixed with the shuffle of dress shoes on polished tile. I stood alone by the flag, its edge barely brushing my shoulder. For a moment, the quiet felt heavier than the courtroom noise ever had. The verdict was final. Cyrus, guilty on all counts, aggravated assault, conspiracy, falsification of military records, 15 years, no parole recommendation, stripped of rank, awards rescinded, name scrubbed from base honors. Harlan sat motionless when the sentence was read. No objections, no protest, just lowered eyes as if he were attending a funeral he couldn't quite admit was his own. I didn't watch them be escorted out. I didn't need to. When the bailiff finally opened the courtroom door for the public to leave, I waited until the last chair creaked before stepping away from the flag. Dorian caught my eye from across the room, but he didn't move toward me. We'd already said what needed saying before we entered. Outside the sky was that uncertain shade of gray-blue. Neither mourning nor rejoicing. Just a tired kind of peace. 3 months. That's how long it had taken from the moment I pressed that emergency beacon in my quarters to this day. A season of gathering, fighting, and refusing to shrink. 3 months of watching old allies retreat, new ones surface, and learning to carry the silence differently, not as shame, but as armor. The night before the final hearing, I'd sat alone with a small steel box. Inside it, the metal that had once been mine, then his, then broken, then mine again. The original engraving had been scratched out, the new one re-etched with careful precision. It read, reforged, not replaced. When they called me to testify, I wore it around my neck. Not for the judge, not for the cameras, but for the girl I used to be. The one who thought being quiet made you good and being obedient made you loved. I kept my answers measured on the stand. When asked to confirm my father's identity, I spoke clearly. Yes. And I no longer call him mine. You could feel the air shift. A quiet ripple as if the walls themselves needed a second to absorb it. When the prosecutor asked if I had anything more to say, I opened the box and held up the metal. Some things break, I said to the jury. Others, we reforge. That's who I am. Afterward, one of the press officers muttered, that was a headline before the ink dried. I didn't care. Let them write what they needed to write. I'd already written mine. The real moment came later in a hallway outside the courtroom. A woman I didn't recognize approached me. Civilian clothes, no badge, carrying a child on her hip. She didn't introduce herself. She just said, "Thank you." And then added, "He did the same to me, but I couldn't say it." I nodded once. She didn't need to explain. We all have ghosts. Mine just wore uniforms. Back at my apartment that night, I stood in front of the mirror with my blazer still on, collar slightly turned. I hadn't eaten all day. My hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from the aftershock of standing up for yourself when the world expects you to fold. There was no celebration, no cake, no congratulations party, just a voicemail from my lawyer, a long silence from my father's side of the family, and a new file sitting on my desk, the official copy of the court decision. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like cleanup. Later, I took out a pen and wrote on the back of the envelope, "Justice is only the beginning." I didn't want revenge. I wanted airspace to breathe in a world where I didn't have to apologize for taking up space. The next morning, I woke up early. I dressed in civilian clothes, neutral, simple. I pinned the reforged metal to the inside of my coat, not where anyone could see it, but close enough that I could feel the weight against my chest. At the Veterans Center downtown, I met with the new program director. She'd read my story online, seen the interview I reluctantly agreed to give after the trial. "I think we can use your voice," she said. "Women in uniform need somewhere safe to land." We spoke for over an hour. When I left, I had 3 folders in hand and the first draft of a workshop schedule saved to my inbox. On the way home, I passed the base gate for the first time without needing to enter. I slowed the car, glanced at the checkpoint, then drove on. No bitterness, just distance. As I reached the corner of my street, I pulled over, stepped out, and walked toward the park. It wasn't crowded, just a few kids playing, an older man walking his dog. The flagpole near the entrance flapped softly. I stood there watching it move, then whispered, "Justice isn't the end. It's just the beginning." For a second, I felt the sun break through the clouds because healing is harder than any war I've ever fought. 6 months had passed since the verdict, and every morning since then, I woke up in a bed that belonged to no one but me. No bunk above, no inspection-ready sheets, no buzzing alarms telling me when to eat or move or report, just light coming in through linen curtains, the scent of black coffee from the kitchen, and the quiet hum of a life being rebuilt. That morning, I stood in front of the same window where my uniform now hung, not as a symbol of burden, but as a memory, clean, pressed, whole. It swayed slightly from the ceiling fan's breeze, just enough to remind me it was still mine, even if I no longer needed to wear it every day. The house was modest, just enough space for silence to feel sacred instead of suffocating. I'd bought it just outside Fayetteville, close enough to feel tethered to the place that had shaped me, but far enough to choose who had access to my door. I was sorting through the last box of my mother's things when I found it. The envelope was unmarked except for my name and her handwriting. Delilah's cursive, always slanted, always slightly too tight, as if even her penmanship had learned restraint. I stared at it for several seconds, then sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and opened it slowly. The letter was brief. "If you're reading this, it means your father never changed, but you must speak when I couldn't. Your voice is your inheritance, Vienna." I read it 3 times before setting it down in my lap. There were no apologies in her words, no explanations for the years she remained quiet, no justifications for the nights she chose stillness over protection, just a simple passing of the torch. A mother's final instruction. I cried then, not because of pain, but because something finally released in me, like a knot that had been tied so tightly for so long had finally mercifully come undone. 2 days later, I received a package in the mail. It had no return address, but I recognized the handwriting on the label, my former commanding officer. Inside was a manila folder. When I opened it, I found the original report from Syria, the unedited one. My name was there, bold in ink beside the words "Primary Medical Responder, stabilized under hostile fire. Saved 2 lives." At the bottom it had his signature, dated, sealed, notarized. It wasn't just validation. It was restoration. I didn't send it to the military press. I didn't post it online. I just scanned it, saved a copy, and slipped the original into the drawer beside my bed. Some victories are meant to be held, not flaunted. That spring, I started volunteering at the local Veterans Center. At first, it was just light work, helping with intake forms, organizing supplies, greeting new arrivals, but it didn't take long before I was asked to sit in on peer support sessions, especially when the topic drifted toward trauma or silent suffering. I listened more than I spoke. But when I did speak, I noticed people leaned in a little closer. Not because my story was unique, but because I wasn't afraid to tell it anymore. Eventually, I began a small group just for women. No titles, no ranks, just a circle of chairs, some coffee, and a promise of no judgment. We called it Bravo Echo, a quiet nod to our shared battlefield, being heard. One Tuesday evening, a young woman in her 20s pulled me aside after the session. "My dad said, people who speak out ruin families," she whispered. I looked her in the eye. No. People who hurt others ruin families. People who speak out stop it from happening again. She didn't cry, but she did nod. I walked her to her car. The next week, she brought a friend. It was slow work, quiet work, but it was real. I was no longer surviving. I was shaping something for others, something that wouldn't vanish when I did. On Memorial Day, I stood near the edge of the local parade, my hands in the pockets of a simple beige coat. The air was warm, the scent of hot dogs and kettle corn lingering in the background as marching bands passed by, notes sharp and proud. An American flag waved high, its fabric catching the sun just right. The crowd clapped as veterans walked by. I saw a few I'd helped through the center. They gave me small nods. I returned them with something quiet but certain. Near me, a young boy stood beside his mother, hand raised in a crooked salute. She tried to fix it, but he kept tilting it wrong. I bent down beside him and gently adjusted his fingers. Like this, I said softly. He looked up at me, unsure. Are you a soldier? Once, I said. But I still remember how to stand. He grinned. As they moved on, I turned back toward the flag. I didn't think about my father. Not then. I didn't think about Cyrus or the medal or the months in the hospital or the hearings. I didn't need to. The war inside me didn't end in a courtroom. But it ended with truth. And truth once spoken never goes back to silence. Sometimes the deepest betrayals don't come from strangers, but from the ones who share your blood. Deanna's story isn't just about justice. It's about reclaiming the truth when everyone else tries to bury it.